She lifts her face, the boy in khaki, the girl in lace.
Welcome to the 22nd episode of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Murray Shapiro, proudly he served. As a Jewish American, Murray Shapiro couldn't wait to volunteer in World War II. He was well aware of the Nuremberg Laws and the racist treatment Jewish people received in Germany. He lost his spot in officer school because he objected to the racist views his Major Carvell held towards black people. During the Battle of the Bulge, Shapiro would receive the Bronze Star for his actions, organizing a rear guard and defending it until his outfit was able to withdraw. In doing so, Shapiro was left completely surrounded behind enemy lines and had to make a harrowing journey back to his platoon. From the Battle of the Bulge to the Colmar Pocket to the crossing of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, this episode focuses on Murray Shapiro's World War II experiences. During the 1990s, while serving as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, my family and I visited many of the sites associated with World War II, from the beaches of Normandy, where the D-Day landings took place, to the Ardennes forest, where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, to the death camps of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau. We saw what was at stake in World War II, when not only democracy in the U.S., but throughout the world hung in the balance. I began to write to World War II veterans to thank them for their service. I sent them pictures of the sites we visited. I invited them to share their stories with me, and I promised to keep them alive in the classes that I taught. What I never could have anticipated was that veterans shared their stories with their buddies and printed my letters in reunion newsletters. I was soon corresponding with approximately 140 World War II veterans, 20 of whom received the nation's highest honor, the Medal of Honor. I had more material than I could ever use in the classes I taught, so to keep my promise, I wrote Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, and I launched this series of podcasts, which are based upon the book. As a young man, Murray Shapiro couldn't wait to volunteer. He had supported the war effort from the very beginning. Shapiro had been in the ROTC in school and was very patriotic. More importantly, as a Jew, Shapiro read what Germany was doing to the Jews after the Nuremberg Laws. I thought the humiliating treatment was enough to make me burn. Little did I know about the death camps, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in America at the time. I wanted to make sure that here was one Jew who was going to do his part. Basic training took place 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, with the only day off being Sunday. In basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, Murray Shapiro of Chatsworth, California, was pretty disappointed when Sunday came and he went to the nearest town, Columbus, Georgia. He described Columbus in a letter written at the time. "It's a dead place. They have blue laws here which could close up everything on Sunday. One can't even buy a Sunday paper. It must be bought on the previous Saturday." Columbus had just 2 movie theaters, and Shapiro lamented that they both showed westerns. Still, he did manage to find a store that sold Fort Benning t-shirts and sent his family one. At Fort Benning, Shapiro had been in officers' training school until he washed out of it on the last day. Despite having a straight A average in his courses, Shapiro was told that he does not have at the present time possess all the qualifications necessary for an officer and a gentleman. Shapiro knew the real reason was that he had aggravated the anti-black prejudices of his company commander, Major Carvell. Although Shapiro didn't provide too many details, in college at UCLA before he enlisted, he had participated in the Bruin Victory League, which supported U.S. entry into World War II and was opposed to fascism. As part of the Bruin Victory League, Shapiro had protested the haircut requirements for white and black soldiers because black soldiers had to travel further to get a haircut due to segregation. He had also questioned why there were separate USOs for whites, Jews, and blacks. It bothered him that so many of the men in the main stockade at Fort Benning were black, so it was easy to see how he may have fallen out of favor with Major Carvell. Shapiro eventually shipped out from the New York harbor on the Mauretania on September 7, 1944, arriving in Liverpool, England 10 days later. London at the time was still being targeted regularly by German V-1 and V-2 bombs, so the U.S. Army did not station any unnecessary troops anywhere near London. Shapiro wrote about the destruction they had wrought on London. Not only were whole city blocks leveled, but the craters created by the bombs left huge pits, some of them easily 3 or 4 stories deep, and as wide and as long as a city block. Shapiro's destination was Alton Park, a commando training camp. While training continued there, Shapiro found it wasn't as strenuous as it had been at Fort Benning, Georgia, or as rough as Camp Roberts had been in California. The cooler weather helped, as did the fact that Shapiro was now in excellent shape. Murray Shapiro served in M Company, 112th Infantry Regiment, 28th Infantry Division of the 1st U.S. Army. Most of the time he was in combat, Shapiro served as a section leader of 2 heavy machine guns. Murray Shapiro landed on Omaha Beach 4 months after D-Day. By then, the only opposition he faced was the rain-soaked muddy path as he marched slipping and sliding to the top of Omaha's cliffs. Even though the night was pitch black, once atop Omaha's cliffs, Shapiro realized he was not alone. My buddy and I pitched our shelter halves in the rain. We were on the fringe of the newly established cemetery, which already had over 1,000 graves. The raw recruits that landed on Normandy's beaches received life-saving advice from war-weary veterans of the D-Day invasion. In his unpublished memoir of the war, Shapiro recalled advice that he never forgot. Veterans told us that 2 actions did more to expose our positions to the enemy than any others: lighting cigarettes and jingling dog tags, identification medals we all had strung around our necks in case we were wounded or killed. We each carried 2, and they tended to hit against each other when we walked, causing a slight noise. To prevent their dog tags from clanging together, most of the GIs sacrificed their gas masks, using the rubber lining to encase their dog tags. Machine gunners had an extremely high fatality rate in World War II. The average life of a heavy machine gunner during a firefight in World War II was 1 to 1.5 minutes. Shapiro found the advice that combat veterans gave him to be more important than any Army manual. A few examples. Pulling out every 3rd round of machine gun bullets which were tracers and substituting them with regular rifle bullets. Running relays to the trigger of machine guns so that when you pulled the string from far down the trench, the gun would fire. The immediate return fire that took out the gun wouldn't take you out too. As 1944 drew to a close, it seemed that the Allies had the Nazis on the run everywhere. British Field Marshal Montgomery declared confidently on December 15th, "The enemy is at present fighting a defensive campaign on all fronts. His situation is such that he cannot stage any major offensive operations." Montgomery couldn't have been more wrong. Within a day of his remarks, the Germans mounted their largest counteroffensive yet on the Western Front. 30 divisions amassed along a line of 80 miles from Münster, Germany, in the north to Echternach, Luxembourg, in the south, with 1,000 tanks and about 1,500 aircraft. Amazingly, the Germans assembled 500,000 troops. Allied reinforcements were rushed to defend the Ardennes forest. Even troops back home in the U.S. found they were reassigned. Eventually, the Americans assembled some 600,000 U.S. soldiers to oppose the Germans. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. Initially, The German assault was a great success, aided by bad weather and the lack of Allied air support. The Allied forces were pushed back as far west as 80 miles from their original positions. When the Battle of the Bulge broke out, Shapiro and his outfit were dug in across a small but deep valley across the formidable Siegfried Line, Germany's massive fortifications guarding the approach to Germany proper. Shapiro had been living in a small man-made cave, one hill to the rear of the main front. He awoke at 4:30 a.m. on December 16th to unfamiliar sounds. Instead of the relative quiet, occasional burst of German burp guns, there was instead a loud, an indescribable and indistinguishable noise. That was it. It was just plain noise. In addition, the front was ablaze with lights. The Germans had moved batteries of Klieg lights and noise machines with huge speakers to the front, focusing them on the Allied positions. Shapiro momentarily left his crew and got to a point where the light no longer blinded him. Using his binoculars, he could see the real purpose of the uproar. The Germans were bringing up masses of tanks and disguising the sound and sight with this stunt. Shapiro immediately reported to his captain, who asked him to call up S2 Battalion Intelligence. Shapiro picked up the signal phone and related what he had seen to an intelligence officer. The officer responded, "Sergeant, you must be mistaken. We have no reports anywhere along the front of unusual enemy activity." With Sergeant McGinnis and 2 gunners, Shapiro set off to find their machine gun emplacement. It was snowing heavily, and they had to rely on landmarks to find their way. They made their way to an anti-tank crew position that was completely unmanned. The GIs were asleep in a cave they had dug out behind their gun. Shapiro asked McGinnis if they should wake them. "You know, if you do, he's gonna get fucking mad at us," McGinnis replied, so they continued walking. They hadn't gone more than 50 yards when they encountered 10 shadowy figures walking slowly towards them, their head and shoulders bowed down with the weight that they carried. It wasn't unusual to see soldiers carrying heavy loads, but something seemed strange about these men. McGinnis ventured that they must be part of a carrying party from K Company. Because the troops had been in a set position for a while in their small man-made caves, the company cooks had organized carrying parties to distribute hot meals to the foxholes during periods of darkness. Before long, though, Shapiro and McGinnis saw 10 more figures to the right of the original group and another 10 to the left. The 30-man patrol began moving towards them in a semicircle to prevent their escape. Quickly, our 2 gunners decided to foil that tactic and took off for the gap in the hedgerow. They made the escape to warn the company. Shapiro and McGinnis turned straight around to try to alert the anti-tank platoon. Like the motion in an early two-reel comedy, we began to walk fast slowly, and the Germans picked up the pace a little. We walked fast, they walked a little faster. We ran at breakneck speed, they ran too. Running the fastest, Shapiro reached the anti-tank crew, still sleeping in their cave dugout, and woke them, shaking them violently. Wake up, you jerks! The Germans are coming! The Krauts are on the way down the hill, in force! As the crew drowsily began putting their boots on, Shapiro feared that they would never man the guns in time. Suddenly, Shapiro heard McGinnis's carbine firing. He grabbed his M1 rifle and started to take aim, just as a German potato masher, a long stick grenade, landed on the cave's roof. Shapiro yelled, "Grenade!" and hit the ground. The blast knocked Shapiro's helmet off backwards. It appeared to kill Sergeant McGinnis. Momentarily stunned, the sight of Germans charging with their bayonets quickly brought Shapiro to his senses. Grabbing his helmet, he began crawling as fast as he could through a 4 to 5 foot thick hedgerow barrier. The Germans did not follow him through the thick tangle of brambles. Instead, they decided to run around it, but had about 75 to 100 yards to do so. Shapiro wasted his head start, though, by trying to free his rifle from the brambles that had entwined themselves around the trigger guard. Hard as I tugged with the force of desperation, I could not dislodge my basic weapon. Shamefully, I had to leave it there and take off just as the enemy was rounding the hedge and heading towards me. Desperate, Shapiro soon realized that even if he succeeded in outrunning the Germans, they could still pick him off with their rifles on the long, somewhat barren slope. Shapiro jumped into a small depression on the slope and hid himself as best as he could under the leaves, pine needles, and mountain sage. His ruse worked. The first German advance soon passed him. No one noticed him, although he had to bite his tongue when one German stepped on his finger as he passed. A second wave of Germans soon set up position with heavy machine gunners and light mortars. From his hiding place, I could hear for hours the shouts of their company commander as he called upon his chief subordinate to supervise the gun emplacements and answer emergency. Feldwebel Müller! Feldwebel Müller! Feldwebel Müller! Morning soon turned to afternoon. Shapiro knew he had to leave his hiding place. Even if the Germans didn't discover him, the GIs would soon be firing everything they had at the slope to take out the machine gunners and mortars. Deciding it was better to take his chances by running for it than be killed by friendly fire, Shapiro jumped up and ran diagonally down the slope near the pine forest as fast as he could. Not a shot was fired at him. Shapiro ran down the slope and saw what he thought was a telephone wire laid by the Americans. He followed it up the next slope, but artillery began firing at him. He quickly ran back down and began following a small river stream, which eventually came to a valley. Shapiro continued to follow the stream until he reached a nearby abandoned regimental headquarters. Everyone had left it, except for the switchboard operator. Shapiro was given some dry clothing, a new Garand rifle, ammunition, and a cot to sleep in. The next morning, a lieutenant informed him that he was going to help command a rear guard, along with 2 other refugee sergeants and an officer. All had been separated from their units. Their orders were to hold back the Germans until what was left of the regiment could escape across a small bridge over the Our River. They were given bazookas and machine guns, but no ammunition. They did have plenty of hand grenades and sufficient rifle ammunition, but they knew they were no match for the German Tiger tanks. There was no sign of the enemy until late afternoon, when a company of 2 tanks and infantry came down the hill, with riflemen preceding and following the tanks as front, rear, and flank guards. The men Shapiro had been given to command quickly began running down the slope to the valley floor. Not understanding what they were doing, Shapiro yelled after them, calling them cowards, and ordered them back. They ignored him and kept running. Shapiro soon regretted his words. It turned out that these were anti-tank men and that they were running to a concealed anti-tank gun camouflaged on the valley floor. As soon as they reached their gun, they began desperately to tear off the camouflage netting. The lieutenant asked Shapiro to help. He began firing his rifle at the soldiers, marching alongside the 2 tanks. The tanks and the soldiers stopped. The lead tank had spotted the anti-tank crew's action and let go a blast from its 88mm cannon, ripping the camouflage netting and the tankers from the gun. It looked as if all the crew had been killed by the one shot. Then the tank swiveled its cannon to my position. I froze in fright, discontinuing my firing. To my great surprise and relief, I noticed that one anti-tanker was still alive. He was mounting the gun and turning the barrel towards the tank. The German tank noticed it too and stopped its swivel towards me, reversed itself, and began turning back to the threat in the valley. Shapiro shouted encouragement to the anti-tanker. He got off one shot, hitting a gas can on the side of the tank. The tank exploded in flames. Quickly the crew began to exit. The other tank turned back, as did the accompanying soldiers. I took up my rifle, firing again, but this time with little accuracy. The entire target area was engulfed with flame and smoke, obscuring my aim. The enemy retreated back over the ridge, and for the rest of the day and for most of the night, we lay undisturbed in our mission. Later that night, the Germans came back down by another trail, leaving their tanks but using grenades. They killed most of the Americans who were put on rear guard and quickly occupied the bridge, putting machine gun nests on either side of it. Eventually, Shapiro received word from his lieutenant that he and the remaining soldiers still with him were to move quietly up the ridge towards their old front lines and to try to circle behind the enemy, then back to the river. Shapiro was last in this procession. 30 minutes later, still bringing up the rear, Shapiro and the soldier, whose name Shapiro never knew, were told to halt. A German patrol had been spotted ahead. As a result, they were ordered to set up the perimeter defense and to be very quiet. The private and Shapiro set up their perimeter defense facing outward. After about an hour, Shapiro whispered that he was going to see what was happening. Quietly, he crept to what was supposed to be the center of the rear guard. No one was there. Apparently, they had been given the order to retreat, but that order had not reached Shapiro and the private. Returning back, Shapiro and the private decided to head back towards the river. At first they crawled, and then they crept, and feeling a bit more confident, began running. Within 15 minutes they spotted another German patrol and dove into the shrubbery on either side of their path. Again, Shapiro found himself covering with pine needles and leaves. After about 15 minutes, the patrol was completely past. Shapiro rose and began looking for the private. He whispered, "Private! Private! Soldier! Soldier!" But no answer ever came. He had apparently taken off by himself. Shapiro made his way, once again completely alone, back to the river. He followed it upstream, determining it was too cold and the river too swift and wide to attempt to cross. Shapiro figured the river would get more narrow the further upstream he went. Instead, the opposite seemed to happen. The river was becoming wider. If Shapiro was going to get across, it was now or never, no matter how cold or swift the water was. He took off his heavy gear, the steel helmet, his ammo belt, canteen, grenades, cartridge belts, coat, and field jacket. He kept on his layered clothing, 3 pairs of long johns and 2 pairs of wool uniform shirts and pants. He also kept on his boots, which he soon regretted, since they made it very difficult to swim. Wading into the river, Shapiro was relieved to find that the shelf extended underwater for quite a bit and that he could wade out a bit. But when the shell exploded overhead, he instinctively hit the ground, which in this case was freezing cold water. The shock of going full body and face into the chilled water momentarily immobilized me, and I had horrible thoughts of drowning, Shapiro recalled. Not the strongest of swimmers, and in freezing cold water, Shapiro found it took everything he had to battle the current and get to the opposite side. Exhausted, he pulled himself out of the river and collapsed on the snowy bank. Eventually, he got himself up and began walking. With no signs of the enemy present, he walked down a road to a small village somewhere in Malmedy. He banged on the door of the first house he found. A short woman answered, threw up her arms, and begged him to leave. Shapiro made it clear that he wasn't going to leave until she gave him some dry clothes. Finally, she handed him some socks, a sweater, and a raincoat, which he immediately put on. Deciding it was best to stay off the main road until he was behind enemy lines, Shapiro traveled for 4 days, taking to the relative security of the hills. Shapiro followed communication wires that led to now abandoned artillery dugouts, where he scavenged for whatever K or C rations he could find. A hungry Shapiro had a dead man to thank for his dinner. My last food discovery, which kept me going another day, I painfully dislodged from the frozen grip of a dead infantryman who got it from an enemy artillery shell. I pried a tin and 1 can of corned beef hash from under his arm and borrowing his bayonet to cut open the can. The can, like the infantrymen, was already opened in small pieces. Both were ridden with shrapnel. But hunger caused me to ignore the situation and to begin eating the hash. It was frozen solid, and for the day I lived only on this source of food. I was forced to melt small chunks in my mouth, occasionally spitting out chunks of shrapnel in the process. By his 5th day of trying to evade German soldiers, Shapiro was exhausted, his whole body frozen from the constant cold and dampness. After watching a small village for about an hour, it seemed abandoned. Shapiro thought he might be able to warm himself and perhaps find some food in one of the abandoned houses. As he walked down the village's one street, a door opened and an old, gray-haired woman peeked out of the opening. "Infantry?" she called out to him. Shapiro no longer looked the part, having lost his weapons, helmet, and pack. Shivering from his soaking wet pants and boots, he responded, "Oui, ja." The old woman opened her door widely and motioned for him to come in. Once inside, Shapiro found she was not alone, but had 4 beautiful young daughters. The daughters quickly removed his wet raincoat, boots, and socks so that they could dry by the fire while the old woman made him some coffee and sandwiches. As Shapiro sat barefoot, embarrassed to be clad only in his long johns, he attempted to converse with the family in broken French with a smattering of German thrown in. In his diary, Shapiro recalled the conversation. As the conversation had progressed, it became very clear that this family was not Belgium. She and her 4 daughters were refugees from the German city of Aachen. She showed me with dramatic motions how our bombers leveled her home during the almost complete destruction of that city. Having driven through Aachen himself a few weeks earlier, Shapiro knew the city had been reduced to little more than rubble, in most places no more than 3 to 5 feet high. Struggling to find the right words in French, Shapiro managed to ask the old woman, who he now knew was German, "Then why are you feeding me?" The old woman lifted 5 fingers and responded in her mix of English, French, and German, "I have 5 sons who are also in the infantry, the German infantry." Shapiro at once understood. The obvious point was that I was in the infantry. Her 5 sons were also in the infantry, though in different uniforms. To her, it made no difference. We were all mother's sons. I was dumbfounded and pretty much humbled. I didn't say anything for a few minutes. I volunteered for the Army Infantry to go overseas and kill Germans. From this point on, I was only trying to defeat Nazis, as distinct from all Germans. Shapiro's silence was broken by the rumbling of German panzers that could be heard approaching the town. "Panzers!" the old woman cried out. Shapiro hurriedly began putting back on his now dry clothing, the old woman and daughters helping him. Concerned that if the Nazis discovered that the family had aided him, they too would be killed, Shapiro intended to run out the front door and put as much distance between me and the house as I could, so the Nazis would not assess any blame to these people. Just as he was about to open the door, the old woman put her hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "Nein, nein," she declared, leading him to the back of the house and a narrow path that weaved its way up to a wooden hill. Shapiro told her, "Mercy," as she gave him one more sandwich before he made his escape into the thick cover of the woods. It was another day before Shapiro could hear artillery shells, telling him he was getting closer to the battle lines, where he could hopefully rejoin his regiment. Around 3 a.m., the day after he left the German family who had saved him, Shapiro found a Belgian barn just outside another village, and he went in to thaw out from the falling snow and catch a few hours of sleep. It wasn't long before he was awakened by a terrified woman. She began screaming, "Bulge coming! Bulge coming!" constantly motioning me to leave. She had come to milk her cows, and now she was sure the Germans would kill her cows, herself, and her family if they found me there. Reluctantly, Shapiro left the barn at daybreak. The screaming artillery shells passing overhead in both directions told him he was very close to the front, perhaps in between the battle lines. "I did not know which fire was the enemy's or ours," Shapiro wrote. Shapiro decided he'd better quietly pass through the village so as not to encounter enemy soldiers or more terrified townspeople. As he was passing by another farm in the rear of the town, his raincoat caught on a wire fence. I was quickly surrounded by a gaggle of screaming, pecking, and very annoying geese. They did a better job of guardianship than any watchdog I had witnessed. Hearing the ruckus the geese were making, a small group of townspeople quickly ran over to Shapiro and formed a semicircle around him. Shapiro finally pulled his coat from the wire and stood erect, trying to make the best impression he could, as he asked, "Whose artillery is that?" "Les Americans," they said as they pointed to the nearby explosions. Not wanting to disclose which side he was on quite yet, Shapiro asked in the little bit of Franco-German he knew, "Que kilomètres? How many kilometers are the Germans?" The villagers gestured to where the shells were exploding in the nearby woods. Noting that they seemed to smile a bit when they said Americans, Shapiro told them, "I am an American soldier of the United States First Army. Can anyone please tell me where my front lines might be?" One villager introduced himself as the mayor, and he offered to provide a guide, a young woman who spoke English, to Shapiro to help him find his lines. The woman led Shapiro for several miles through the forest until they reached an area where the German shells were landing. She then hastily left him on his own. Shapiro ran through the forest, knowing he was close to the U.S. troops. Suddenly he heard a loud command, "Halt, or I'll fire!" Shapiro had encountered a two-man artillery observation team, and he was grilled by its master sergeant. It was now December 21st. Shapiro had largely been separated from his regiment since December 16th. As a result, Shapiro didn't know the correct countersign for the day. The master sergeant began asking Shapiro a series of questions, mostly on baseball. "Who pitched for the Dodgers in 1941? What was so-and-so's batting average?" Since Shapiro wasn't much of a baseball fan, he didn't know most of the answers. To make matters worse, Shapiro had lost most of his U.S. Army-issued uniform, as well as his helmet and his rifle. Shapiro didn't have his uniform to prove his unit designation, and the clothing the kindly German family had given him resembled more closely the German field gray than the American olive green. "Look, Sergeant," Shapiro began, "for God's sakes, ask me the name of our regimental or divisional commander, or something of American history, or about Los Angeles, California, where I come from. I just don't follow sports. Is that a crime? I just came back from a rear guard, saving what's left of this damn regiment. I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I am very cold." A captain then came out of concealment and began asking Shapiro a new line of questions that he fortunately was able to answer correctly. Satisfied with his identity, he was taken to a jeep and driven to a small village and to the colonel's headquarters. The colonel questioned him about the rear guard and told Shapiro that they were still surrounded, but were trying to break out into the British sector. The colonel told Shapiro that he was the last survivor of the 40-man rear guard to report back. "The only ones to survive was myself and two other sergeants. One sergeant, a first sergeant, had crawled hand over hand under the bridge after the Germans had taken it and had posted machine gun nests on either side. The other sergeant had swum the river like myself, but much earlier than I had. Shapiro would receive the Bronze Star for heroic action against the enemy for organizing a rear guard and defending their position at all costs until the bulk of his unit outfit was safe and he himself completely surrounded behind enemy lines. The colonel had no weapons to give him, but he did give Shapiro a warm blanket and allowed him to sleep by the stove for the night. Their sleep was interrupted by a lone German Stuka bomber that dropped a bomb very close to the colonel's house, frightening everyone. Shapiro requested if he could rejoin his company and his machine gun platoon as soon as possible. His request was granted, and Shapiro soon found himself reporting back to his platoon leader. The platoon leader filled me in on what had happened since Sergeant McGinnis and I had left the company area that fateful morning to replace the crews in our gun section. I learned that 36 Tiger tanks had ripped through our company area, part of the SS division. Some of the tank crews cried out from their hatches, ridiculing the members of the Blitzkrieg division, as they called us, the Bloody Bucket, their description of our Pennsylvania National Guard divisional insignia patch that we carried. The Pennsylvania National Guard's insignia was a red keystone, symbolic of the state, but the guardsmen soon adopted the Nazi description of the patch, adding, "Their bucket, our blood." Shapiro also learned how the company had been saved by a lone Jewish-American soldier. It seems the company was saved by an American soldier who was Jewish and knew enough German Yiddish to call out confusing orders to the Wehrmacht infantry accompanying the tanks to retreat, go to the left flank, etc. He stayed in his foxhole, continuing to yell out these confusing orders, even when he was told to retreat with his unit. He stayed there firing his .45 and yelling commands in the fog until he was readily and finally shot dead. During the next couple of days, the regiment continued to mostly retreat, attempting to avoid enemy encirclement. They made a stand at Beeler before withdrawing to Rogery. By Christmas morning, they had withdrawn to some woods and were issued 1K ration for the day to eat. Christmas Day we were retreating, living on top of the snow without adequate clothing and no shelter and hungry as could be. My only thought was wishing the pain would stop from the terrible cold and the frostbite in my feet. Things improved significantly, though, the day after Christmas when the unit moved to Rouge-Miniere, where they received badly needed replacements and a belated Christmas dinner, complete with turkey and all the trimmings. By early January 1945, the weather was beginning to improve, and the Americans regained the offensive. A much more enjoyable effort, Shapiro recalled. They soon retook the towns of Ivelle, Bois de la Bayou, Grand Coup, Wany, and Wanneranville. Wanneranville proved more difficult to retake. Not only was the German army interdicting one end of the road, our artillery was doing the same thing on the other end. Germans were also still in a part of the town trapped with us, so neither side could let down its guard for fear of a shell burst or a surprise infantry attack. Shapiro's unit took position for 2 nights in an abandoned house filled with ammunition and one very badly wounded German soldier. Shapiro recalled the men of his section voting on whether or not to shoot the wounded German soldier. He was shot in an embarrassing and very painful spot, his genitals, and he was groaning in pain. He looked pretty well exhausted and in utter misery. His uniform indicated he was Volksturner, People's Militia, mainly composed of old men and boys. But he was lying in a room full of loose ammunition, including rifles, rifle ammo, and hand grenades. Because of the guns and the ammunition in the house, the injured German required round-the-clock guard duty, meaning even less sleep for the GIs. Tired of listening to the injured man's agonizing moans, One GI suggested they put him out of his misery. Another protested, arguing that would amount to murder. As squad leader, Shapiro suggested they vote on it, though he told the men that he would abstain. Being Jewish, his vote would have been for execution. It was close, but the GIs decided to let the wounded man live. Shapiro, however, couldn't resist telling the injured German if it had been up to him, he would have been a dead man. After all, Shapiro told the injured man he himself was a Jew. The injured German's response reminded Shapiro of his own humanity. Men are men. Some of the men then shared a K-ration with the wounded German and gave him some water. Shapiro was impressed that the GI who had argued that the wounded German be put out of his misery was also the same GI who got out of his warm bedroll in the middle of the night and helped the wounded man urinate, since he couldn't manage it on his own with his wounds. Eventually, relief arrived, and the wounded German was evacuated. Shapiro never knew whether he lived or not. Between January 8th and 9th, Shapiro's outfit found itself fighting alongside the 30th Division. His machine gun platoon was told to set up an outpost in a deserted town that had been the site of SS atrocities. A Nazi SS division had passed through the town and had killed every single civilian in it. After we set up our guns in a bombed-out house on the edge of town, I decided to explore the place. Most of the dead bodies were now almost covered over with falling snow. Bodies seemed to be everywhere. American GIs, German SS, and many civilians. The grimmest discovery lay in a large V-shaped ditch that ran through the back of the town. A small amount of water slowly seeped down the channel, but filling that channel almost to the top were bodies of dead civilians, many with noticeable bullet holes in them. Shapiro also found many dead, charred civilian bodies in the houses, including the body of an old 80-year-old woman sitting in a rocking chair with a bullet hole in the middle of her forehead. In another house, Shapiro found the remains of 3 dead Nazis and the charred remains of 2 civilians. In another room of the house were the remains of a stamp collection, scattered on the table and the floor. Shapiro quickly gathered it together and eventually sent it home to his family, as detailed in a V-mail letter he sent on January 11th, 1945. His gruesome discoveries in the town gave credence to the story that several riflemen had told him days earlier. Their squad had come upon a group of SS in the nearby forest. They had tied up some GIs and were about to torture them with irons that they had heated in a fire that they were gathered around. The riflemen told me that up to that point they had been taken prisoners, but they took none from this group, killing all that they could. As the Battle of the Bulge was coming to an end in January 1945, a new fierce battle broke out to the south and centered on the city of Colmar. The Germans fought fiercely to hold a block of 850 square miles on the west side of the Rhine River, as it was the last French territory they still possessed. During the Colmar campaign, Shapiro's outfit was attached to General Patch's 7th American Army, which was then transferred to General Lot de Tassigny's 1st French Army. Shapiro led a section of machine guns. Attached to Shapiro's section was a small group of Moroccan soldiers, who were very good soldiers, but they fought very dirty. One night, the leader of the Moroccans told Shapiro that they were going forward behind enemy lines for a short while and not to worry about it. After a few hours, the Moroccans returned, their faces smiling. They assured Shapiro that the platoon's advance would now be considerably faster. They had found sleeping German soldiers. They had castrated them, and then they had shoved their genitals into their mouths, then retreated back to our lines. The Moroccans' actions disgusted Shapiro, but he was also relieved that they were on his side and not on the German side. Shapiro was one of 8,000 Allied soldiers who crossed the Rhine River over the bridge at Remagen, also known as the Ludendorff Bridge, in speeding trucks and jeeps before the Germans finally succeeded in destroying it. I rode through Aachen in a jeep after we crossed the Remagen Bridge before it collapsed. We were speeding along to get as far down the Rhine as we could so as to cut off German reinforcements to the bridge. As we passed to Aachen, standing up in the jeep, I could see over the entire city. There is not a pile of rubble more than 3 feet high to obscure my view, except the skeleton of the main cathedral. Our Air Force and the British had thoroughly demolished the city. Years later, when Shapiro returned to the site of the bridge in 1989 with his wife Shirley, they found the remnants of the bridge with the towers on either side of the river still standing. Together they toured the museum. Shapiro was particularly interested in finding the sign that the unit which had taken the bridge had erected, attached to the towers on the opposite side, facing us troops as we sped across, attesting to the fact that we were crossing with dry feet due to their initiative and courage. He was relieved when he finally found the sign on the 7th level of the museum, just as he remembered it. Death was an ever-present possibility for the GIs in both theaters of war. Some turned to alcohol to take the edge off, but far more turned to their faith in God to help them endure the horrors of the war. The old adage that there are no atheists in foxholes was, for the most part, very true. In general, the military recognized the important role religion played in the lives of the GIs and tried to meet their spiritual needs during World War II. Murray Shapiro recalled that most GIs, if they chose to, were able to attend services regularly. If you were Catholic or mainline Protestant, you could go to service in the field, even at the front line, except, of course, during the 3 months of the Battle of the Bulge. If you were in the rear echelon, you could go at least once a week and even use civilian churches. For Murray Shapiro, however, it was more difficult to practice his faith because he was Jewish and Judaism was a minority religion in the army. Shapiro explained, "This has nothing to do with discrimination. Chaplains were assigned quite naturally in numbers equal to the troops' religions. However, all chaplains were trained to administer to the needs of other religions, including even last rites." Shapiro had great respect for all the chaplains and fondly remembered a Protestant one who helped him receive a well-deserved leave a sergeant had unfairly denied him. But Shapiro found that there were other challenges to practicing Judaism besides just the absence of rabbis, challenges that the chaplains couldn't resolve. First of all, in training Friday evening, the Jewish Sabbath, is GI night in the barracks. That is when the barracks are emptied and scrubbed from floor to ceiling. Anyone who chickens out at that time is completely ostracized. So I never miss GI night. Also, training is a 24-hour affair, 6 days a week. Only Sunday is off. As a result, Shapiro only attended one Jewish service in the 3 years he spent in the Army. Not being able to attend Jewish services didn't bother Shapiro as much as what one might think. I can't say that I was really that put out about missing services, as I was somewhat of an agnostic at that time. Watching someone die in the midst of a prayer during a mortar attack didn't enhance my belief in the efficacy of religion at the time either. Pulikowski, the soldier Shapiro saw die in the midst of prayer, had been assigned as a replacement ammo carrier the night before. Not only did he know nothing about heavy machine guns, he had never fired one in his life, or seen the infantry variety up close, Shapiro wrote. After the Battle of the Bulge, replacements were needed so badly in the front lines that men like Pulowski were sent to the front with little or no training. Although still a green recruit, Pulowski did know enough to dig a foxhole, and he dug a deep enough one that would have protected him had he used it properly. Terrified by his first combat experience, Pulowski knelt in his foxhole exposing his chest and his head above the ground level. In the midst of a prayer to the Virgin Mary for protection, Pulowski failed to hear the whistling approach of a light mortar shell. After the mortar exploded, Shapiro glanced over at Pulowski. His mouth was frozen open, but his eyes were closed, and his face had taken on a black, purplish shade. Shapiro checked the man for a pulse, and he reported to his platoon sergeant that he couldn't find one. Not seeing a wound, the sergeant and Shapiro pulled Pulowski out of the foxhole to find out what had happened to him. As they did so, Pulowski's head fell backwards, and Shapiro examined him more closely. "We looked down the exposed throat, and we discovered what had killed the man. In the midst of a prayer asking that his life be spared, a single large piece of shrapnel had gone down his throat and choked him to death." Murray Shapiro was in Germany when VE Day was announced. It seemed strange to hear ticker-tape parades were being held in New York and jubilant celebrations were occurring in England. Shapiro wanted to join in, but as he wrote his parents, "We felt like raising whoopee, and we had the alcoholic methods of doing so, but generally speaking, things were pretty quiet. The civilians didn't have anything to celebrate, and we didn't have anyone to celebrate with." After the war, Shapiro taught for 54 years as an educator with the Los Angeles Unified School District, Cal State Los Angeles, Mount St. Mary's University, and UCLA. He also taught at a secondary school in Nigeria and was a religious school principal for Westwood Temple, Temple Israel of Hollywood, University Synagogue, and Temple Beth Emmet of Burbank. Shapiro stayed active in veterans organizations until he died on September 26, 2020, at the age of 97. On Memorial Day 1996, Murray Shapiro sent me a letter and expressed that "us old vets are most anxious that our struggles live on in the memories of those who follow us." It seems like the least that we can do to honor the memories of those who sacrificed so much for our freedom.
Tenderly he sighs, "I will come back to you. Oh, my darling, please do," she replies, and so will he.
Our song today, "A Boy in Khaki, a Girl in Lace," was released in 1942 with music by Ali Rubel and lyrics by Charles Newman, and it was performed by the incomparable Dinah Shore. If you liked this podcast of Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, please leave us a review on whatever podcast network you use. Follow our podcasts and tell your friends. New episodes come out bi-weekly. You can find the companion book on Amazon.com. Until next time, thank you for remembering our World War II veterans.